humans as a species are quite different from our close relatives in terms of all of our social worlds being colored, shaped by culture. And to somebody coming from a cultural anthropology or like a social science perspective, that's obvious. But I think that from somebody like being an evolutionary anthropologist, that means that I'm curious in how we got there and how that functionally changes the social interactions that we have in ways that would be quite different from what we see in chimps. And there are other fields of evolutionary social science where they kind of try to get as far as they can in understanding how we form friendships or how we form coalitions in ways that are kind of similar to chimpanzees or bonobos or other monkeys. And I want to kind of get at the kind of minimal differences that then are human specific, at least they are now, that maybe make the ways that we form friendships or the ways that we engage in intergroup interactions, or even the ways that we make reproductive decisions, which are so fundamental to fitness consequences, how those might be different because we are a fundamentally cultural species. So it's a kind of roundabout way of saying that, but that's what I'm trying to get at with that phrase.
That makes sense, yeah. And so what would be the differences between like the cultural or social worlds of our closest relatives and us?
Yeah, so they definitely are group living, right? So it is good to note that orangutans, chimpanzees, probably to some extent gorillas, but it's less obvious, and bonobos, like they engage in social learning, they use tools, they live in social groups, like their social lives are rich and they're have complex ways of managing those, right? So I don't want to take away from that. And I think that by some people's standards, they're also cultural because they socially learn from each other. But I think in a very fundamental way, they're not that cultural. Obviously, it's a continuum, it's a spectrum. These things evolve gradually. But they don't have a lot of shared cultural information that structures their social groups. And secondly, they don't seem to enforce norms. So norms, they can be just descriptions of how people act in a particular social group, but they can also be norm enforced. They can be enforced by punishment or ostracism or gossip. And there's no strong evidence that chimpanzees like judge other chimpanzees negatively if they don't, for example, do termite hunting the way that like other chimpanzees do, or in their social group, or if they don't do the hand clasping in the right way. Whereas humans are great at that. Like we're great at judging people for not following all sorts of rules that seem sometimes good for the group, but sometimes not necessarily good for the group. So for chimpanzees, like the closest that we have is some evidence that, for example, when females migrate at sexual maturity, and when they do, there are a couple pretty well documented case studies showing that they change how they do certain cultural things. I forget if it was like a foraging task or if it was a hand clasp, but they do seem to accommodate what others are doing in their social group. But that could just be driven by kind of learning what's going on around them, not because they're being judged. And it's just a much smaller set of cultural rules that they have to keep track of. So when we think about human social groups, we think like a lot of them have a lot of differences in terms of which rules have to be followed. And you know, other things that are not rule-based, but like cultural knowledge, traditions that are maybe not norm-enforced. Technology sometimes differ across different groups. And so this becomes a much more cultural world than it is for a chimpanzee. And when we migrate at marriage, which is common in a lot of human societies, we're often doing it, frankly, like within cultural units, which is a bit different than like with chimpanzees migrating at reproductive maturity. They will generally be moving kind of the only social group boundary that they have, whereas we have social groups that are culturally similar, we have social groups that are culturally distinct, and marriages in human societies tend to be within culturally similar ones. But we then also have these other kinds of intergroup interactions between more culturally dissimilar groups. So all of those are ways that I think kind of our evolutionary history then differs from in the social case from those of our close relatives.
So it sounds like you're saying, if I can kind of summarize it, that
Yeah.
like a big thing is that humans have these norms in their cultures that maybe other species kind of have, but we really judge people for not enforcing those norms. In fact, I've heard that like one of the reasons that we're so empathetic, one of the reasons our empathy develops as a person, is because like when we're young, we're often like scolded when we're mean to someone, and so we develop a kind of sense of like empathy for others.
Oh, interesting.
And that's why we kind of feel like nervous about hurting other people's feelings. So maybe that plays into as well, like the judging, the punishment aspect of it. And yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I can't imagine like a chimpanzee mother telling their child to be nicer to somebody else in their group, right? Yeah, I think there's some people would argue that like empathy is a human-specific kind of psychological adaptation. I don't know enough about that area, but we definitely start enforcing norms on children, and children themselves in a lot of cultures start enforcing norms like in middle childhood, like around age 8 or so in some societies. Like they already start punishing people who are, for example, greedy in lab experiments.
Interesting.
But I don't have a strong sense of whether that's kind of like a genetically evolved intuition that we have, or if it's just something that's socially acquired.
That makes sense. Yeah. My girlfriend's brother is 2 years old, and like I noticed that he copies things almost immediately and very accurately too, that people do. Like even like little like comments people make, he'll like copy it, or things they do.
Yeah.
So probably that's another aspect of it. We're so like so wired to copy others and what they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's pretty interesting. So kind of zooming back out a little bit with intergroup interactions, which is kind of a similar thing with this. What kind of are the factors? We talked about judging, we talked about punishment, we talked about moving between cultures, but in general, what are the factors that influence how we treat like other people specifically?
Oh my gosh, a lot. So I've wondered, specifically because I'm so interested in kind of how culture changes these dynamics. I wondered if, for example, part of the variation in how we treat other groups comes down to how culturally distinct they are and how difficult it is to interact with them. So for example, this is a very silly coordination game, but if you're to give a sense to your audience of what a coordination game is, it doesn't really matter if we as a society decide to drive on the right side of the road or the left side of the road, right? But we should be on the same side. Like we should agree on that. And there are a lot of cultural rules or norms that are like that it doesn't really matter if we decide that, you know, the husband's family should pay for bride wealth or at marriage, or the wife's family should pay dowry at marriage, but we kind of have to be on the same side on that. Or how do we raise our children? Do we want to be very punitive, or do we want to be more relaxed about it? All of these probably are going to have kind of similar outcomes at the group level, even at the individual level, but we have to be on the same side to make it easier to interact with others. So one possibility that might explain kind of avoidance, at least, not hostility, but just to get to intergroup avoidance or kind of wariness about interactions with outgroup members, is that you want to make sure that you're not going to kind of fail to coordinate in an interaction. And most people who study intergroup interactions, I think, focus much more on like the higher levels of hostility, right, that we get. And that wouldn't explain it. Like just cultural dissimilarity shouldn't get you to intergroup hostility. Because it's worth noting that intergroup differences could also get you lots of benefits, right? There's a lot of reasons why you would want to interact across cultural group boundaries, because they have knowledge that you don't have, because they have resources that you don't have and you want to exchange with. And the evolutionary history of humans shows that, well, it's hard to detect sometimes exactly what's going on socially from the archaeological record, but the archaeological record quite deeply into the Paleolithic shows that we've been exchanging, or at least we've been getting goods from far away for quite a long time. So obviously there are these benefits to intergroup interaction that you wouldn't want to preclude with these kind of hostile, innate kind of intuitions. And I don't know, a lot of people presuppose that we do have these kind of like innate, genetically evolved intuitions to be fearful and then hostile to cultural outgroups. And I'm not sure that we have like strong evidence of that. Maybe wariness, maybe concern over this coordination. There's some kind of early developmental work suggesting that children, for example, prefer to interact with others who have the same accent as their parents. But the hostility, I think we need some kind of cultural props to get us there.